The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between life and death. Sarah's team moved with the kind of precision that only comes from years of training and the desperate clarity of knowing that every second counted. Elena and Marcus successfully transported Sergeant Morrison to the relative safety of their forward aid station in the ravine. The young soldier's condition had stabilized somewhat, but Sarah could see the gray pallor of his face that indicated ongoing internal bleeding. He would need surgery within the hour, or they would lose him regardless of their rescue efforts. Dr. Park had managed to prepare the unconscious driver for transport, rigging a makeshift spine board from debris and carefully securing his airway. The man's pulse was thready, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored, but he was alive. Sarah administered emergency medications to try to stabilize his blood pressure while Park monitored his neurological responses. The sound of automatic weapons fire had grown significantly closer, and Sarah could hear Rodriguez shouting orders to his men as they fell back to tighter defensive positions. The flanking movement was succeeding, and their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "Last run," Sarah announced to her team as they prepared to return for Williams. "We go in fast, we extract him, and we get out. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Everyone goes home today." But, as they prepared to leave their cover, Sarah noticed something that changed everything. Williams had managed to shift his position slightly and was pointing urgently toward a large piece of debris near his trapped leg. Following his gesture, she saw what had captured his attention: an unexploded device, probably another improvised explosive that had failed to detonate with the initial blast. "Everyone stop," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through the noise of battle. The device was close enough to Williams that any attempt to free him could potentially trigger it, killing not only him but anyone in the immediate vicinity. Dr. Park crawled closer to examine the situation. His military background included some explosive ordnance training, and, after a careful assessment, he delivered the news Sarah had dreaded. "It's unstable," he said quietly. "Any significant vibration or movement could set it off." The cruel irony was devastating. They had risked everything to save Williams, only to discover that saving him might be impossible without triggering an explosion that would kill them all. The young soldier had apparently noticed the device earlier but had chosen not to mention it, not wanting to prevent the team from helping the other casualties. Williams looked directly at Sarah, his eyes clear despite his pain. "Doc, you did everything right. Sometimes that's all you can do. You need to get out of here now." Sarah stared at the device, her mind racing through possibilities. Her training had never covered scenarios like this, where medical intervention was complicated by explosive hazards. She thought about her daughter, about her husband, about the promise she had made to return home safely. But she also thought about Williams, about his family, about the letter he had asked her to deliver. The young soldier had shown remarkable courage throughout the ordeal, never complaining about his injuries and consistently thinking about others even while trapped and in pain. "Park, in your military experience, is there any way to safely disable that device?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Not without proper equipment and training," he replied. "Even then, it would be extremely dangerous. The smart play is to evacuate and call in the explosive ordnance disposal team." Elena's voice carried a note of desperation as she reported their tactical situation. "Dr. Chen, Rodriguez says we have maybe 5 minutes before the enemy position becomes untenable. The helicopters are circling but can't land under fire." Sarah looked at Williams again, seeing acceptance in his expression rather than fear. The young soldier had already made peace with his situation and was more concerned about the safety of the medical team than his own survival. His courage in the face of certain death reminded Sarah why she had chosen medicine in the first place, not for the easy cases, but for moments when human compassion could make a difference in the face of impossible odds. "Williams, what's your daughter's name?" Sarah asked suddenly, remembering the family photo she had glimpsed in his wallet while treating his injuries. "Emma," he replied, a smile crossing his face despite everything. "She's 7 years old and wants to be a doctor when she grows up. She says she wants to help people like her daddy helps people." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes but forced herself to maintain professional composure. "Williams, I want you to record a message for Emma on my phone," she said, pulling out her device. "Tell her whatever you want her to know." For the next minute, Williams spoke directly to his daughter, his voice strong and clear despite his injuries. He told her about his love for her, about how proud he was of her dreams, and about the importance of helping others even when it was difficult or dangerous. His words carried the weight of a final farewell, but also the hope that his sacrifice might inspire others to continue the work of healing and helping. As Williams finished his message, the tactical situation reached a critical point. Rodriguez's voice over the radio was urgent as he reported that enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. The medical team had to evacuate immediately or risk being overrun. Dr. Park placed his hand on Williams' shoulder. "Soldier, it's been an honor serving with you today," he said with military formality. "Your courage has saved lives." Elena and Marcus had already begun moving the two stabilized casualties toward the extraction point where Rodriguez's men could provide covering fire. Sarah was the last to leave Williams, staying with him until the very moment when remaining would have meant certain death for the entire team. "Doc, go," Williams said firmly. "That's an order from a soldier to his medic. You've got other people counting on you." Sarah squeezed his hand one final time, then sprinted toward the extraction point as gunfire erupted from what seemed like every direction. Behind her, she could hear Williams calling out to the attackers, apparently trying to draw their fire away from the escaping medical team. The evacuation itself was a blur of helicopter noise, gunfire, and desperate medical procedures performed under impossible conditions. Both Sergeant Morrison and the civilian driver survived the flight to the field hospital, where emergency surgery saved their lives. Morrison would eventually regain most of the function in his legs, and the driver made a complete recovery after weeks of intensive care. Williams did not survive. The explosion that claimed his life occurred approximately 10 minutes after the medical team's evacuation, triggered either by enemy fire or by the device's own instability. Rodriguez later reported that Williams had continued calling out tactical information to help the remaining soldiers until the very end. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in her own hospital back home, having returned to the familiar world of sterile operating rooms and predictable procedures. But everything had changed. The experience in that remote valley had stripped away her illusions about medicine and replaced them with a deeper understanding of what it meant to heal. She had learned that sometimes the most heroic medical intervention was knowing when to stop, when to accept limitations, and when to honor the wishes of patients who understood their situations better than their doctors did. Williams had taught her that courage wasn't about eliminating fear, but about acting in spite of it for the benefit of others. The letter Williams had asked her to write to his family became the hardest thing Sarah had ever composed. But it also became the most important, because it allowed her to share his final message and to explain how his sacrifice had saved other lives. Emma Williams, now 8 years old, wrote back to thank Sarah and to tell her that she still wanted to be a doctor, inspired by both her father's courage and Sarah's dedication. 6 months after the incident, Sarah received notification that she had been awarded a civilian medal for valor, recognizing her actions under fire in saving the lives of Sergeant Morrison and the civilian driver. But the award that meant the most to her was a hand-drawn card from Emma Williams, showing a picture of a doctor helping soldiers and signed, "Thank you for being brave like my daddy." Sarah returned to humanitarian missions 3 months later, but with a different perspective on the role of medicine in crisis situations. She established a training program for medical personnel working in conflict zones, emphasizing not just medical skills but psychological preparation for making difficult decisions under extreme circumstances. The program included case studies based on her experience, teaching future humanitarian medical workers about the realities of working under fire and the importance of maintaining hope and humanity even in the darkest situations. She never mentioned Williams by name in her lectures, but his influence was evident in every lesson she taught about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of medical service. Dr. Park continued working with the organization and eventually became Sarah's co-director for the training program. Elena returned to her home country but maintained contact with the team, often sharing stories of how their experience had influenced her approach to emergency medicine. Marcus left humanitarian work but carried the lessons of that day into his career as a paramedic, where he became known for his willingness to take calculated risks to save lives. The field hospital they had been trying to supply eventually received the medical equipment it needed, delivered by a later convoy that traveled under heavy military escort. The villages in that region now have access to basic medical care, and infant mortality rates have decreased significantly. Williams' sacrifice, along with the courage of the entire medical team, had ultimately achieved its intended purpose of saving lives. Sarah often reflected on the question of whether their mission had been worth the cost. Williams had died, but Morrison and the driver had lived, along with the countless villagers who would benefit from the medical supplies and hospital services. The mathematics of such decisions would never be simple, but Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in numbers but in the willingness to act with compassion in the face of impossible choices. Every year on the anniversary of that day, Sarah received a letter from Emma Williams, now pursuing her own medical education and preparing to follow in her father's footsteps by serving others. The young woman's determination to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, had become Williams' most lasting legacy and Sarah's greatest source of inspiration for continuing her own work in humanitarian medicine. The sprint across open ground felt like an eternity, though it lasted less than 30 seconds. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran in a crouch, her medical bag bouncing against her hip with each step. The sound of her own breathing seemed impossibly loud, competing with the distant crack of rifle fire and the pounding of her heart. Dr. Park reached the ravine first, diving into the shallow depression just as a burst of automatic gunfire stitched across the ground where he had been running. Sarah tumbled in beside him, scraping her knee on the rocky ground but feeling relief wash over her as she found cover. Behind them, Elena and Marcus made the crossing successfully, though Marcus stumbled and nearly dropped the emergency medical kit. The ravine was barely 4 feet deep, offering minimal protection, but it was enough to shield them from direct fire. Sarah could hear Rodriguez and his remaining soldiers providing covering fire from their defensive positions, their weapons creating a steady rhythm that seemed to keep the enemy occupied. "Status report," Sarah whispered as they caught their breath. The ravine ran roughly parallel to the road, bringing them closer to the burning lead vehicle but still keeping them hidden from the main enemy positions in the rocks above. Dr. Park pointed ahead to where they could see the overturned military vehicle. "I can see at least 2 casualties from here," he said. "One soldier is trapped under the vehicle's rear axle, and another is sitting against the far side, but he's not moving much. There might be others I can't see from this angle." Elena and Marcus quickly set up their forward aid station in a slightly wider section of the ravine, organizing medical supplies and preparing to receive casualties. The nurse had transformed from the frightened woman in the vehicle to the consummate professional Sarah remembered from their previous missions together. As they moved closer to the wreckage, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The lead vehicle had been hit by what appeared to be an improvised explosive device, probably triggered remotely when the convoy reached a predetermined point. The blast had flipped the heavy military transport onto its side and scattered debris across a 50-meter radius. Sarah could now see 3 casualties clearly. The soldier trapped under the axle was conscious but appeared to have severe leg injuries. Another soldier was slumped against the overturned vehicle, blood visible on his uniform but his condition unclear. A third man, the civilian driver, was pinned in the cab of the vehicle and wasn't moving at all. "We need to prioritize," Sarah said, falling back on her medical training to override the emotional impact of seeing such injuries. "Dr. Park, can you assess the driver while I check on the soldier by the vehicle?" "Elena, prepare for multiple trauma patients." Moving from the relative safety of the ravine to the exposed area around the wreckage required another dangerous sprint. This time, the enemy fire was more intense, as if the attackers had spotted their movement and were trying to prevent any rescue attempt. Sarah reached the injured soldier first, dropping to her knees beside him despite the continued gunfire. The man was young, probably early 20s, with sergeant stripes on his torn uniform. He was conscious but going into shock, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Hey there, Sergeant," Sarah said in her calmest voice while quickly examining him. "I'm Dr. Chen. We're going to get you out of here." Her hands moved expertly over his body, checking for wounds and assessing the damage. She found the source of the bleeding. Shrapnel had torn through his left side, and he was losing blood faster than his body could compensate. "Doc, my legs," the sergeant whispered. "I can't feel my legs." The word sent a chill through Sarah as she realized the implications. A quick neurological assessment confirmed her fears. The soldier had likely sustained a spinal injury in addition to his other wounds. Meanwhile, Dr. Park had reached the civilian driver and was working to extract him from the twisted cab. "Sarah, I need help over here," he called. "This man is alive but barely. We need to get him out now." The sound of approaching helicopters gave Sarah hope, but she knew that air support wouldn't be able to land in the current tactical situation. The rescue would still depend on their ability to stabilize the wounded and somehow get them back to the medical vehicle. Elena appeared at Sarah's side with medical supplies, having made the dangerous crossing while Sarah was focused on her patient. "Doctor, we have a problem," she said urgently. Marcus spotted more movement in the rocks. "It looks like the attackers are trying to flank our position." Sarah continued working on the sergeant while processing this new information. The tourniquet she applied to his leg helped slow the bleeding, but he needed surgery soon or he would die. The spinal injury complicated everything. Moving him incorrectly could cause permanent paralysis or worse. Elena, radio Rodriguez and tell him about the flanking movement, Sarah ordered while setting up in 4-line. We need more time, but we can't hold this position much longer. Dr. Park's voice carried a note of urgency as he called out from the vehicle cab. I've got the driver stabilized, but his injuries are severe. Possible internal bleeding, definite head trauma. We need to move him, but I need help to do it safely. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Rodriguez's voice crackled over their radio, informing them that his men had spotted at least a dozen attackers moving to surround their position. The backup forces were still 40 minutes away, and their ammunition was running low. Sarah looked at the 3 wounded men and made a calculation that would haunt her for years. The sergeant with spinal injuries would require careful handling and multiple people to move safely. The driver was unconscious and would need constant monitoring during transport. The soldier trapped under the axle would require mechanical assistance to free him. Park, how long do you need to extract the driver? She asked while continuing to work on the sergeant's wounds. 5 minutes if I have help, 10 if I'm alone, he replied, his voice strained with effort as he tried to shift debris. Sarah's mind raced through the options. They could try to save all 3, but the time required would likely result in the entire team being overrun. They could focus on the 2 most viable patients and abandon the trapped soldier, but that violated every principle she had sworn to uphold. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and she could see muzzle flashes from new positions that suggested the enemy was indeed flanking their location. In a few minutes, their small depression would be surrounded, and any hope of escape would vanish. Elena, get Marcus over here with the emergency stretcher, Sarah decided. We're going to move the sergeant first, then come back for the driver. Dr. Park, can you keep working on the extraction while we make the first run? Elena's expression showed she understood what Sarah wasn't saying. They might not be able to come back for everyone. Doctor, what about the soldier under the axle? Sarah crawled over to where the trapped soldier lay. He was conscious and had been listening to their conversation. Despite his pain, he managed to speak clearly. Doc, I can hear them coming. You need to get out of here while you can. The soldier's name tag read Williams, and Sarah could see that he was probably the same age as her own daughter. His leg was badly crushed, but he was alert and stable for the moment. Williams, we're not leaving anyone behind, she said, though she wasn't sure how she could keep that promise. Marcus arrived with the portable stretcher just as Dr. Park called out that he had freed the driver from the cab. The unconscious man was breathing, but barely, and Park's assessment indicated severe internal injuries that would require immediate surgery. Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her medical career. 3 lives hung in the balance, her team was in mortal danger, and time was running out. The approaching gunfire meant they might have enough time for one more trip to the wreckage, but probably not 2. Change of plan, she announced with sudden clarity. Elena, you and Marcus start moving the sergeant back to the ravine. Park and I will get the driver ready for transport. Then, we all come back for Williams together. It was a desperate plan that relied on speed, luck, and the hope that Rodriguez could hold off the attackers for a few more critical minutes. As her team sprang into action, Sarah allowed herself one quick glance at the approaching enemy positions and said a silent prayer for all of them. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder, but Sarah knew that air support could only do so much in such close quarters. The real fight for these lives would come down to the next few minutes and whether they could defy the odds one more time. Williams gripped her hand as she prepared to leave him temporarily. Doc, if something happens to me, tell my family I was thinking about them. Sarah squeezed his hand back. Tell them yourself when we get out of here, she replied, hoping her voice carried more confidence than she felt. Doctor. Sarah Chen had always believed that medicine was about precision, sterile environments, and controlled conditions. 20 years of experience as a trauma surgeon had taught her to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared her for what would unfold on that sweltering Tuesday morning in the remote village of Kamalpur. The medical convoy had been traveling for 6 hours through dusty mountain roads when the first explosion shattered the morning calm. Sarah felt the armored vehicle lurch violently to one side as debris rained down on the metal roof. Through the reinforced windows, she could see smoke billowing from the lead vehicle ahead, its twisted frame now blocking the narrow mountain pass. "Everyone down," shouted Captain Rodriguez, the military escort commander, as automatic gunfire erupted from the hillside surrounding them. The convoy had been delivering critical medical supplies to a field hospital that served 3 isolated villages, but now they were trapped in what military personnel would later describe as a perfectly orchestrated ambush. Sarah pressed herself against the floor of the medical transport vehicle, her heart pounding as bullets pinged off the armored exterior. Around her, the other medical team members, Dr. James Park, a pediatric specialist, Nurse Elena Vasquez, and medical technician Marcus Thompson, huddled together, their faces pale with fear. The carefully packed medical supplies shifted and rattled with each impact. The attack had come without warning in a region that had been considered relatively safe for humanitarian missions. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal insurgent activity in the area, but, clearly, something had changed. The attackers seemed to know exactly where to position themselves for maximum effect, suggesting either inside information or extensive surveillance of the convoy route. As the initial barrage subsided, Sarah could hear Captain Rodriguez speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for backup and air support. But help was at least 2 hours away, and the wounded from the lead vehicle needed immediate attention. Through the chaos, she could hear someone screaming for a medic. "We have to help them," Sarah whispered to her team, crawling toward her medical bag. The vehicle's communication system crackled to life as Rodriguez received an update from his men. 3 soldiers were critically wounded in the lead vehicle, and 1 civilian driver was trapped beneath twisted metal. Elena grabbed Sarah's arm. "Doctor, it's too dangerous out there. We should wait for the fighting to stop." Her voice trembled, but her grip was firm. The nurse had served in war zones before and understood the calculated risks that medical personnel had to take. Sarah looked at her team, seeing her own fear reflected in their eyes. She thought about her daughter back home, about the promise she had made to her husband to be careful on this mission. But then, another scream pierced the air, followed by an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than the gunfire. Dr. Park, despite his specialization in pediatrics, had combat medical training from his military service years earlier. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast and smart," he said, checking his own medical kit. "Rodriguez, what's the tactical situation?" The captain's voice was grim as he explained their position. The convoy was pinned down in a narrow valley with steep cliffs on both sides. The attackers had taken positions in caves and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover and clear sightlines to the road. Any movement outside the vehicles would be extremely dangerous. "But here's the thing," Rodriguez continued, pointing to a tactical map. "There's a small ravine about 50 meters to our right. If we can reach it, we might be able to approach the lead vehicle from a different angle. The wounded are on the far side, partially shielded by the wreckage." Sarah studied the terrain through the vehicle's periscope. The ravine was shallow, offering minimal cover, but it was their best option. The distance seemed impossibly far under enemy fire, but she had taken an oath to do no harm and to help those in need, regardless of the circumstances. Marcus, the medical technician, began organizing the emergency medical supplies they would need. "We'll need trauma kits, blood products, and something to stabilize spinal injuries if there are any," he said, his training taking over despite his obvious fear. "We can't carry everything, so we need to prioritize." As they prepared for what could be a suicide mission, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small town, she had always wanted to help people, but her vision of medicine had been shaped by television shows and movies where doctors worked in pristine hospitals with endless resources. The reality of humanitarian medicine was far different. She had volunteered for this mission because the villages in this region had no access to advanced medical care. Children were dying from preventable diseases, and women were facing complicated pregnancies without proper medical support. The field hospital they were meant to supply could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people. But now, as gunfire echoed through the valley and her colleagues prepared to risk their lives, Sarah wondered if her idealistic vision of helping others was worth the potential cost. The logical part of her mind screamed that they should wait for military backup, that risking 4 more lives to save 3 was poor mathematics. Yet every instinct she had developed as a doctor told her that those wounded soldiers were running out of time. In trauma medicine, the first hour after injury was crucial, the golden hour that often determined whether patients lived or died. She had seen too many cases where a few minutes of delay had made all the difference. Elena finished checking their portable medical equipment, her movements efficient despite the stress. "Doctor, I've been thinking about approach routes," she said. If we move during the next lull in fighting, we might have a chance. But, we need to be prepared for the possibility that we won't all make it back. The weight of leadership settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. As the senior physician, the decision was ultimately hers. She looked at each member of her team, seeing determination mixed with fear in their faces. These were good people who had volunteered for humanitarian work because they believed in making a difference. Outside, the gunfire had become sporadic, suggesting that either the attackers were conserving ammunition or repositioning for another assault. Rodriguez reported that his men had established a defensive perimeter around their vehicles, but they were still significantly outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah made her decision with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme crisis. "We go," she said simply. "But, we do this smart. Elena, you and Marcus will establish a forward aid station in the ravine. Dr. Park and I will reach the wounded and begin triage. We work fast, we work quiet, and we watch each other's backs." The team spent the next 10 minutes making final preparations, knowing that once they left the relative safety of their vehicle, there would be no turning back. Sarah checked her watch, noting that it was now nearly noon. The sun was directly overhead, which would make them more visible but might also create some glare that could help obscure their movements. As they prepared to move out, Sarah caught herself thinking about a lecture she had attended during medical school about battlefield medicine. The professor, a grizzled army doctor, had told the class that combat medicine wasn't just about medical knowledge, it was about making life and death decisions under impossible conditions while maintaining the humanity that made you a healer in the first place. She was about to find out exactly what he meant.